Yemen, a land where ancient brilliance and calculated exhaustion are separated by only a single blockade. Hidden behind a fog of permanent crisis, this coastline stands as the world's most suppressed geography, defying every official narrative of the 21st century. It is a realm where mud-brick skyscrapers rise like defiant monoliths from a soil that holds the world's oldest secrets. Where the shadow of a drone now pours over ruins that once dictated the flow of global wealth. But behind this engineered collapse lies the heavy pulse of a nation isolated not by accident, but by the strategic necessity of foreign powers. Today, we cross the threshold of the Gate of Grief to examine the crime scene of a stolen legacy, the unseen Yemen. This is a place that pioneered global trade 3,000 years ago, functioning as the original architect of the Arabian Peninsula. Established by the 8th century BCE, the Kingdom of Saba was the primary superpower of the ancient world, famous for a hydraulic mastery that turned a barren dust bowl into a lush, engineered marvel. They constructed the Great Dam of Marib, where the surviving sluice gates still stand as evidence of a civilization that mastered the desert before the rest of the world knew how to irrigation. By the modern era, the world's most traded commodity, coffee, flowed from these shores, turning the port of Mocha into the global center of innovation and wealth. But if you only focus on the headlines of war, you won't see the deliberate erasure of this greatness. It is a multidimensional investigation, from the annexed biological fortresses of the coast to the weaponized thirst of the highlands. To the west lies the Bab el-Mandeb, where 18 miles of water control nearly 10% of all global trade, creating a landscape that is as valuable as it is volatile. Heading toward the occupied silence of Socotra in the south, the mystery transforms into a silent land grab, where nature is the cover for a new kind of geopolitical theft. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I want to know exactly how far these hidden stories are reaching. The question we must ask is not why Yemen is in ruins, but why those ruins are being denied their place in history. When you look at the fractured landscape of 2026, you aren't seeing the organic failure of a state. You are seeing a masterpiece of geopolitical sabotage. The official narrative would have us believe that the chaos in Sana'a or the starvation in the Tihama plain is a localized tragedy, a simple friction of tribes and religion. But if you look at the map, the geometry tells a different story. Yemen is not a casualty of war, it is a victim of its own significance. It sits on the Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Grief. This 18-mile wide strait is the jugular vein of the global economy. Nearly 10% of all maritime trade, and the undersea fiber optic cables that carry the world's data, pass through these waters. The instability we see today is the perfect fog. It serves as a convenient screen for external powers who realize that a unified, prosperous Yemen would hold the literal key to the world's wealth. We are told the current conflict is a civil feud, yet the fingerprints of global superpowers are found in every dry well and every targeted heritage site. This is the architecture of erasure. By framing Yemen only as a war zone, the international community effectively deletes the fact that this was once the Silicon Valley of antiquity. When a bomb falls on a Zaydi mosque or a Sabaean ruin, it isn't collateral damage. It is the systematic removal of a culture's receipt of its own former greatness. Every time we are shown an image of a starving child without the context of the blockade that caused it, the erasure is successful. The goal is to make the world forget that the people standing in those bread lines are the descendants of the architects who built skyscrapers of mud when the rest of the world was living in caves. We are here to investigate the mechanism of this decline, to understand who benefits when the gate is wide open for trade, but slammed shut for the people who call its shores home. To understand the magnitude of what has been stolen, we must look at the label the world has pinned to this soil, the world's most dangerous country. This is not a description, it is a shroud. It is designed to ensure you never look at the blueprints of the Great Dam of Marib or the vertical cities of the highlands. For centuries, the Romans called this land Arabia Felix, Fortunate Arabia. This wasn't a poetic observation of the scenery, it was a cold, geopolitical reality. While the rest of the Arabian Peninsula was a nomadic hardship of desert, Yemen was a lush, engineered marvel of sophisticated hydraulics and global trade dominance. The injustice lies in the decoupling of the Yemeni people from their own legacy. We are witnessing a systematic identity erasure, where the descendants of the world's first civil engineers are being rebranded as perpetual victims of a tribal feud. The investigation reveals that the mystery isn't why Yemen is failing today, it is how a civilization that mastered the desert 3,000 years ago was forced into a state of managed dependency. Think about the skyscrapers of Shirban. Long before New York or Chicago, Yemenis were building 7-story apartment complexes out of sun-dried mud. They mastered the skyscraper DNA in a landscape that should have been uninhabitable. Yet today, the modern world watches as these towers liquefy from the inside out because the basic infrastructure of water and sewage has been strategically dismantled. By keeping the population in a state of kinetic survival, searching for bread, searching for water, the world ensures they have no time to claim their heritage. The Gate of Grief earns its name not from the sailors who transit it, but from the millions on the shore who are suffocated by its strategic value. This is the ultimate hidden truth we are uncovering. Yemen is being held in the dark because its geography is too valuable for the Yemeni people to own. When you delete a nation's history, you make it much easier to occupy its future. We are not just looking at a country in ruins, we are looking at the deletion of a culture's receipt of its own former greatness. We are not here to witness a tragedy. We are here to conduct an autopsy on the map. To look at the unseen parts of Yemen is to look at a crime scene where the evidence is being removed in real time. Over the next 14 sections of this investigation, we will move beyond the headlines and into the restricted zones of the Yemeni identity. We will begin at the ruins of the Great Dam of Marib, the original heart of the Arabian Peninsula, to understand how a civilization that mastered the desert 3,000 years ago was systematically decoupled from its own legacy. But the investigation doesn't stop at the mainland. We will travel 240 miles off the coast to the island of Socotra, a biological fortress where foreign powers are conducting a silent, undeclared annexation under the cover of the mainland's chaos. We will examine the hydraulic trap in the highlands, where ancient water security is being traded for a narcotic harvest, and where the world's oldest living city, Sana'a, is being allowed to liquefy from the inside out. The official records will tell you that the insecurity of the Red Sea is a random byproduct of local militias. Our investigation will challenge that narrative. We will look beneath the waves at the fiber optic cables that carry your data, and at the shipping lanes that dictate the price of your bread. We will reveal how the Gate of Grief has been turned into a toll booth of blood, ensuring that Yemen remains in a state of managed exhaustion because its geography is simply too valuable for the Yemeni people to own. This is the story they never wanted you to find. We are walking through the evidence, layer by layer, until we reach the final act, the revelation of why the world needs a broken Yemen to keep the gate open. The investigation into Geo-Mystery Pillar 5, the real story behind the world's most dangerous country, begins now. The Roman Empire did not call this land Arabia Felix as a gesture of poetic flattery. They called it Fortunate Arabia because they were witnessing a geographical anomaly that defied the harsh reality of the surrounding peninsula. While the northern territories were defined by nomadic hardship and a relentless search for survival, the southern tip of the Red Sea had been engineered into a global trade hub. This was not a stroke of natural luck, it was the result of a sophisticated understanding of hydrology that remains unparalleled in the ancient world. The Sabaean people did not just live on the land, they forced the landscape to serve a sedentary, high-density civilization. By the 8th century BCE, they had mapped the seasonal monsoon rains with such precision that they could divert every drop of mountain runoff into a network of stone-lined canals. This was the birth of the original Yemeni identity, a culture of master architects and water engineers. They understood that in a desert, the one who controls the flow of water controls the destiny of nations. This wasn't merely about agriculture, it was about the creation of a permanent, stationary power base that could support a population of 50,000 people in a region that should have been a dust bowl. The investigation into these ancient irrigation systems reveals a level of planning that predates the Roman aqueducts by centuries. These were not primitive trenches. These were stone-carved arteries, some spanning miles, designed to withstand the violent pressure of flash floods while gently distributing life to the terraced fields. This engineering was the foundation of the Sabian kingdom's wealth, allowing them to transform the empty quarter into a corridor of green that the rest of the world looked upon with envy. The physical evidence of this ancient supremacy remains etched into the earth at Marib. The Great Dam was not just a wall of stone, it was a geopolitical statement. Rising nearly 15 meters high and stretching over 600 meters across the Wadi Dana, it was the largest man-made structure in the ancient world. Investigating the sluice gates that still stand today reveals a technical sophistication that suggests the Sabaeans had mastered the physics of water pressure long before the formalization of modern science. The dam allowed for the irrigation of over 25,000 acres of land, creating a surplus of food that acted as a buffer against the volatility of the desert climate. This surplus was the engine of the Sabian economy, providing the stability needed to build the towering mud brick cities that would eventually define the Yemeni skyline. This dam was the heartbeat of the nation. For over 1,000 years, its maintenance was the primary duty of the state, a communal responsibility that bound the various tribes into a single, cohesive identity. It represented the triumph of human intellect over a hostile environment. When we look at the ruins of Marib today, we aren't just looking at broken stones, we are looking at the blueprint of a civilization that refused to be victims of their geography. The sheer scale of the masonry, with precisely cut limestone blocks held together by lead dowels, proves that this was a society with a long-term vision. They were building for eternity, creating a legacy of sustainability that allowed Yemen to remain the most prosperous corner of the Arab world for a millennium. To understand the depth of the modern crisis, one must first recognize the heights from which the fortunate Arabia was forced to fall. With the stability of the Great Dam as their foundation, the Sabaeans turned their attention to the world's most valuable commodity of the era, frankincense and myrrh. In the ancient world, these resins were more than just aromatics, they were essential for religious rituals, medicinal treatments, and royal burials from Rome to China. Yemen held a geographical monopoly on the trees that produced the highest quality resins, and they guarded this secret with the intensity of a modern intelligence agency. They didn't just harvest the crop, they controlled the entire supply chain. By establishing a network of fortified outposts and well-guarded caravan routes, they ensured that every gram of incense that reached the Mediterranean had passed through a Yemeni toll booth. This was the original gate of trade, a strategic chokehold that allowed a single kingdom to dictate the luxury markets of 3 continents. The wealth generated by this monopoly was staggering. It funded the construction of the Maram Bilqis, a temple complex whose massive columns served as a visual reminder of Sabaean power to every passing merchant. This was an economy built on the intersection of rare natural resources and superior logistical control. The investigation into these trade routes reveals that the Sabaeans were not just merchants, they were master diplomats who negotiated treaties with distant empires to ensure the safety of their goods. They transformed the rugged geography of the highlands into a protected corridor of commerce, making Yemen the indispensable middleman of the ancient world. This economic dominance was the identity anchor for the Yemeni people, a realization that their land was the pivot point upon which global trade turned. This wasn't a gift of history, it was a position they earned through a combination of engineering brilliance and ruthless economic strategy. The modern erasure of this golden age is perhaps the most significant injustice in the history of the Arabian Peninsula. By framing the descendants of these architects as a failed people, the international community effectively deletes the record of their ancestral brilliance. Today, the ruins of the Great Dam and the columns of the Sabaean temples stand in the middle of a conflict zone, often used as military outposts or ignored by the global historical record. This is not an accidental oversight. When a culture is decoupled from its legacy of greatness, it becomes easier to manage, easier to displace, and easier to ignore. The Yemeni people are the heirs to a civilization that once taught the world how to survive and thrive in the most extreme conditions, yet they are now treated as a humanitarian burden. The human consequence of this forgotten history is a profound sense of managed exhaustion. A population that was once defined by its mastery of the desert is now forced to stand in lines for imported grain and water. The very terraces that once supported a global trade monopoly are being allowed to crumble into the sand, not because the people have lost the skill to maintain them, but because the modern geopolitical landscape has been designed to make that maintenance impossible. This is the unseen Yemen, a nation whose true identity is buried under the rubble of a conflict that serves everyone except the Yemenis themselves. As we move deeper into this investigation, we must keep this identity anchor in mind. Every bomb that falls on an ancient site is a move to ensure that Fortunate Arabia remains a ghost of the past, rather than a blueprint for a sovereign future. The scale of the Great Dam at Marib is almost impossible to reconcile with the technology of the 8th century BCE. It was a triangular prism of earth and stone, standing 15 meters high and spanning the entire throat of the Wadi Dana. This was not a passive barrier, it was a sophisticated engine for total environmental control. Investigating the surviving north and south sluice gates reveals a mastery of hydraulic pressure that suggests the Sabaean engineers had a deep understanding of fluid dynamics. They used precisely cut limestone blocks, interlocking them with lead dowels to create a structure that could withstand the violent force of seasonal flash floods. This was a megastructure designed to catch the Kharif monsoons, taming the raw power of the mountain runoff and channeling it through a network of primary and secondary canals. By the time the dam reached its peak, it was supporting an agricultural basin of 25,000 acres. This was the largest irrigation project of the ancient world, an artificial garden that functioned as the economic lungs of the Sabaean kingdom. The masonry of the sluices shows no signs of primitive experimentation, it is the work of a society that had already perfected the art of large-scale construction. Every stone was shaped to guide the water with minimal erosion, a testament to a long-term vision of sustainability. This wasn't just a dam, it was a physical manifestation of sovereignty. It allowed a sedentary population to flourish in a region where the nomadic alternative was the only other option. The existence of this wall of stone proved that the Sabaeans were no longer subjects of their environment, but its architects. It was the foundation upon which the Fortunate Arabia was built, a silent witness to 1,000 years of stability and wealth. The forensic evidence of the dam's eventual decline is recorded not just in the silt but in the desperate inscriptions left by the final Sabaean kings. Investigating the layers of the structure reveals a history of multiple breaches, each followed by an increasingly frantic attempt at repair. In the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the inscriptions shift from celebrating victories to documenting the massive labor forces required to patch the failing masonry. Over 20,000 men were once conscripted for a single repair effort, a clear indicator that the social contract of Marib was beginning to fray. The maintenance of the dam was the ultimate communal responsibility. As the central authority of the kingdom weakened, the physical integrity of the dam mirrored the political rot. The stones were no longer being cut with the same precision, and the lead dowels were being replaced by less durable materials. This was the slow death of a masterpiece. The accumulation of silt over a millennium had raised the bed of the reservoir, forcing the water to exert a pressure the original designers never intended. The forensic signs of decay show that the final generations were fighting a losing battle against the very geography they had once mastered. They were living in the shadow of a legacy they could no longer sustain. When we examine the final repair inscriptions, there is a palpable sense of exhaustion. The kingdom was no longer a regional superpower, it was a fragmented society trying to hold back the desert with crumbling limestone. The investigation into these final years reveals that the catastrophe of the breach was not a sudden accident, but the inevitable conclusion of a centuries-long struggle to maintain a standard of engineering that the society had outgrown. The dam was failing because the kingdom had already begun to collapse from within. The final breach occurred in the late 6th century CE, an event so catastrophic that it effectively ended the classical era of Yemeni history. It was not a simple leak. The entire central section of the earthfill embankment was swept away by an unprecedented flood, leaving only the stone sluice gate standing as ghostly bookends to a vanished sea. Reconstructing this event reveals a civilization's sudden exit from the historical stage. Within a matter of weeks, the artificial garden of Marib returned to the dust. The 25,000 acres of green were replaced by scorched earth, and the 50,000 people who relied on the dam were faced with a choice: stay and starve, or abandon the land of their ancestors. This was the moment that Fortunate Arabia died, and that Gate of Grief took its place as the defining reality of the region. The breach was a geographical trauma that triggered a mass migration. This was the Big Bang of Arab history, a scattering of tribes that would redefine the human geography of the entire Middle East. The investigation into the genealogical records of the peninsula shows that the most prominent families of the northern deserts trace their lineage directly back to this exodus from Marib. They were the original refugees of an engineering failure, carrying the memory of the dam with them as they moved toward what is now Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. The loss of the dam didn't just destroy a city, it fundamentally altered the genetic and cultural makeup of the Arab world. The vacuum left by the Sabaeans allowed for the rise of new powers, and the sophisticated hydraulics of the south were replaced by the nomadic resilience of the north. The breach at Marib was the day the world changed, a pivot point that closed the chapter on ancient brilliance and opened a new era of fragmentation. Today, the archaeological state of the Marib ruins provides a chilling look at the difficulty of reclaiming a lost legacy. The surviving sluice gates are surrounded by a landscape of sand and scrub, a stark contrast to the lush basin they once managed. Investigating modern attempts to replicate the success of the Sabaean engineers reveals a series of expensive failures. In the 1980s, a new dam was constructed nearby, but it has struggled with the same siltation issues and political instability that plagued the final Sabaean kings. The ancient masters had a deep, intuitive understanding of the landscape that modern technology has yet to fully capture. They worked with the mountains, whereas modern projects often try to work against them. The silt-buried evidence shows that the original dam was a unique marriage of environment and intellect that may never be repeated. The ruins have become a symbol of the investigative gap between Yemen's past and its present. Why was a civilization 3,000 years ago more capable of ensuring water security than the international community is today? The stones of Marib are not just archaeological artifacts, they are a direct challenge to the modern narrative of progress. They prove that the Yemeni people were once the most advanced hydraulic engineers on the planet, a fact that is inconvenient for those who wish to frame the current crisis as an inevitable result of local incompetence. The sand has claimed the canals, but the masonry remains as a receipt of what was lost. The investigation into the dam reveals that the modern, failed state is actually a state that has been decoupled from its own ancestral blueprints. The ruins are a reminder that the desert is not the enemy is the loss of the collective will to maintain the structures that keep the desert at bay. The human echo of the broken dam is felt most acutely in the modern Yemeni struggle for water. The people of Marib today live in the shadow of a structure they can see but no longer use, a physical reminder of a time when their ancestors dictated the terms of their own survival. This is the moral weight of the investigation. The loss of the dam was not just a historical event, it was a permanent wounding of the Yemeni identity. It turned a nation of architects into a nation of survivors. Every time a modern Yemeni child walks past the towering stone sluices on their way to collect water from a relief truck, the injustice of the managed decline is made visible. The land hasn't changed, the mountains still yield rain, and the stone is still there. What has been deleted is the political and social infrastructure required to harness it. The breach of the 6th century CE set a precedent for the Gate of Grief that persists to this day. It proved that once the hydraulic heart of Yemen is stopped, the entire body of the nation begins to fail. The investigation concludes that the mystery of Yemen's current water crisis is deeply rooted in this ancient trauma. We are looking at a population that has been forced to live in the wreckage of a masterpiece, denied the resources and the sovereignty to rebuild. The story of the Great Dam is a forensic warning. When a civilization loses its ability to control its own geography, it loses its right to a future. As we move forward to examine the skyscrapers of the desert and the annexed islands of the coast, we must remember the lesson of Marib. The ruins are not the end of the story, they are the evidence of a greatness that was never supposed to be forgotten. The strategic mandate for verticality in the valley of Hadramaut was not born from architectural vanity, but from a brutal geographical necessity. Sherbam exists as a walled fortress of 500 individual towers, each rising up to 9 stories, packed into an area of less than half a square kilometer. The investigation into this urban density reveals a dual-purpose defense mechanism. First, the city had to survive the periodic, violent floods of the Wadi, which could turn the surrounding desert into a surging river in minutes. By building upward on a slightly elevated mound, the inhabitants ensured their living quarters remained above the reach of the water. Second, the verticality provided a defensive advantage against the constant threat of nomadic raids. In a landscape where land was the only source of wealth, the footprint of the city had to be minimized to preserve every possible inch of arable soil for agriculture. Every tower in Sherbam functions as a self-contained defensive unit. There are no ground floor windows, the massive wooden doors are the only point of entry, reinforced to withstand a siege. The narrow, winding alleys between the towers are designed to break the momentum of an attacking force and create a labyrinth where the local population holds every tactical advantage. This was a society that understood the cost of isolation. By stacking their lives vertically, they created a high-density social machine that could be sealed off from the outside world at a moment's notice. The vertical mandate was the only way to sustain a sedentary, urban culture in a region defined by tribal friction and environmental volatility. It was a masterpiece of strategic planning that allowed a civilization to flourish in the middle of a conflict zone for over 500 years. The load-bearing engineering of these towers is a challenge to modern structural physics. Each building is constructed entirely from sun-dried mud bricks, a material that should theoretically crumble under the immense weight of 9 stories. Yet, the forensic analysis of the construction reveals a sophisticated understanding of compression and tapering. The walls at the base of a Sherbam skyscraper are over a meter thick, gradually thinning as they rise to reduce the load on the foundation. The mud is mixed with chopped straw and wood ash, creating an organic composite that is both flexible and incredibly strong. This flexibility is the secret to their survival. Unlike rigid cement, the mud bricks can absorb the subtle shifts of the earth and the expansion caused by the desert heat without cracking. The engineering extends to the very chemistry of the soil. The builders used a specific type of clay harvested from the valley floor, which they aged in pits to increase its binding properties. They reinforced the corners and floor joists with the wood of the cedar tree, a dense, termite-resistant timber that provides the internal skeleton for the mud skin. The investigation into these materials reveals a sustainable loop that modern construction has entirely lost. The city is literally made of the ground it stands on. If a building were to be abandoned, it would simply return to the earth, leaving no toxic footprint. This was a civilization that mastered the art of building for the long term using only the resources within walking distance. The fact that these structures still stand, supporting the weight of modern appliances and growing families, is proof that the ancient mastery of earthwork was far superior to the quick-fix solutions of the present day. Deconstructing the internal hierarchy of a Sherbam tower reveals a social machine designed for maximum efficiency and security. The ground floor and first level are windowless, dedicated entirely to livestock and grain storage, acting as a structural and economic buffer for the family above. As you move higher, the function of the space shifts from survival to social life. The middle floors are the private quarters for the extended family, with separate areas for men and women, while the upper levels are reserved for the elite social spaces and open-air terraces. This vertical distribution ensured that the most important members of the household were the furthest from the dangers of the street. The ventilation system is equally sophisticated, with vertical shafts and precisely placed openings that utilize the chimney effect to pull cool air from the shaded alleys through the entire building. This was a society that prioritized the collective over the individual. Many of the towers are connected by elevated bridges at the upper levels, allowing residents to move across the city without ever touching the ground. This created a secondary, private network for communication and defense, invisible to anyone outside the walls. The investigation into this internal anatomy shows that Sherbam was not just a collection of buildings, it was a single, integrated organism. Every floor, every shaft, and every bridge served a specific purpose in maintaining the social and biological health of the community. The human consequence of this design was a level of social cohesion that is rarely seen in modern urban environments. In Sherbam, your neighbor was not just the person next door, they were the person who shared your defensive wall and your cooling breeze. The survival of a mud skyscraper is dependent on a constant, rhythmic labor of maintenance that functions as a communal ritual. The exterior of the buildings must be coated every few years with a fresh layer of lime plaster or refined mud to protect the sun-dried core from the rare but erosive desert rains. This skin is the only thing standing between the structural integrity of the tower and total collapse. Investigating the labor patterns of Sherbam reveals that this maintenance was once a vital part of the city's social fabric, with families and guilds specializing in the delicate art of plastering at extreme heights. However, the modern, managed decline has disrupted this ritual. As the younger generation is forced to seek economic survival elsewhere, the skilled labor pool is evaporating. The structural rot begins the moment the skin is breached. Without the protective coating, the mud bricks absorb moisture, causing them to swell and lose their load-bearing capacity. The investigation shows that many of the towers are now sagging or cracking, not because of age, but because the social infrastructure required to maintain them has been broken. This is the invisible siege. You do not need to bomb a city of mud to destroy it, you only need to ensure the people are too exhausted or too poor to maintain the plaster. The human cost is the slow loss of a 500-year-old family history with every crack that goes unrepaired. When the ritual of maintenance fails, the city begins to return to the desert, one layer at a time. The forensic contrast between Sherbam and the modern cement structures that have begun to appear on its periphery is a study in architectural failure. Modernity has brought progress in the form of concrete blocks and steel, but these materials are catastrophically ill-suited for the Hadramaut environment. Unlike mud, cement traps heat, turning modern homes into ovens that require constant, expensive air conditioning. Furthermore, cement is rigid and heavy. When the ground shifts or the foundations are undermined by failing sewage systems, the concrete cracks and collapses without warning. The ancient skyscrapers of Sherbam have stood for centuries by working with the environment, while the modern alternatives are failing within decades by trying to override it. The question the investigation must answer is why modern engineering continues to push these inferior solutions onto the Yemeni people. The transition to cement is often framed as development, but the reality is that it creates a state of permanent dependency on imported materials and energy. Sherbam represents a peak of sustainable density that the modern world is only now beginning to appreciate, yet the city is being allowed to liquefy because it does not fit into the global economic model of disposable construction. The human consequence is that the inhabitants of Sherbam are being forced to choose between a crumbling ancestral masterpiece and a modern concrete cage. The failure of modernity in the desert is proof that the mystery of Sherbam was never a mystery to the people who built it. It was a sophisticated, proven technology that the world has chosen to forget. The high-altitude basins of the Sarawat Mountains were the site of the world's first global industrial monopoly. It was here, in the terraced highlands of Yemen, that the cultivation of Coffea arabica was perfected, transforming a local stimulant into the most valuable trade commodity of the second millennium. The investigation into this mountain geography reveals a specific combination of volcanic soil and heavy cloud cover that created a climate that was impossible to replicate elsewhere. The Yemeni people were not merely farmers, they were the original geneticists of the coffee bean. By the 15th century, they had developed a system of sun-drying and processing that ensured the highest quality product, making the port of Mocha the single most important economic hub in the Arab world. This was a civilization that understood the strategic value of their crop. They established a network of fortified mountain towns to protect the plantations, ensuring that every harvest was funneled through a single, controlled exit point. The wealth generated by this trade funded the construction of the mosques and palaces of the Tehama coast, creating a period of prosperity that the world has almost entirely forgotten. The golden age of coffee was not an accident of nature, it was a sophisticated, state-run operation that allowed a relatively small territory to dictate the social and economic habits of the entire world. To understand the modern state of the Tehama coast, one must first recognize that Mocha was once the technological and financial equivalent of a modern global financial capital. The security measures at the port of Mocha were some of the most stringent in the history of global trade. The Yemeni authorities were fully aware that the secret to their wealth lay in the fertility of the bean. To protect this monopoly, it was strictly forbidden to export any coffee tree or any bean that had not been parboiled or roasted. This process ensured that the seeds were sterile, making it impossible for foreign merchants to grow the crop elsewhere. The investigation into the port's history reveals a system of inspections that would rival a modern high-security facility. Every ship was searched, and every sack of coffee was checked by state officials to ensure that no live seeds were being smuggled out of the country. This was a national secret guarded with the same intensity as a modern military asset. The port itself was a fortress of commerce, where Dutch, English, and French merchants were forced to pay astronomical prices in gold and silver for the privilege of purchasing the Yemeni harvest. The wealth of the world was flowing into Mocha, and the Yemeni people were the gatekeepers. This was the peak of their economic sovereignty, a time when a Yemeni merchant held more leverage than a European prince. The fortress of the bean was a physical manifestation of a nation that knew its worth and was prepared to defend its intellectual property against the rising tide of colonial greed. The breaking of the Mocha monopoly was not the result of fair market competition, it was the outcome of one of the most successful corporate espionage operations in human history. In 1616, agents of the Dutch East India Company successfully smuggled live coffee plants out of Mocha, eventually transporting them to their colonial plantations in Java. This was followed by similar thefts by the French and the British, who realized that the only way to escape the Yemeni price control was to steal the genetic material of the crop itself. The forensic analysis of these events shows a calculated effort by European powers to bypass the gate of Mocha by relocating production to their own slave labor colonies in the East and West Indies. This theft was a turning point for the Yemeni economy. Within a century, the global supply of coffee had shifted from the sovereign highlands of Yemen to the colonial plantations of the Americas and Asia. The Yemeni people were no longer the sole providers of the world's most traded commodity, they were being undercut by their own stolen technology. The investigation reveals that this was the first major blow to Yemen's geopolitical significance. The world no longer needed the port of Mocha because the secret had been distributed among its rivals. The corporate espionage of the 17th century set a precedent for the managed decline that persists to this day, proving that when a nation's primary source of wealth is stolen, its sovereignty is the next thing to vanish. The relocation of coffee production triggered a permanent economic depression for the Tihama coast. As the trade shifted to European-controlled territories, the massive flow of gold and silver into Mocha ceased. The investigation into the labor patterns of the 18th and 19th centuries reveals a population that was forced to pivot from high-value exports to subsistence farming. The terraces that once produced the world's most coveted crop were abandoned, and the sophisticated irrigation systems began to fall into disrepair. Yemen was no longer a global superpower of commerce, it was being relegated to a historical footnote as a producer of specialty beans for a market it no longer controlled. This was the displacement of wealth on a civilizational scale. The loss of the coffee monopoly stripped the Yemeni state of the resources needed to maintain its infrastructure and defend its borders. The fortunate Arabia was being systematically transformed into a region of managed poverty. The human consequence was a loss of agency. The descendants of the world's most powerful merchants were now subject to the whims of global commodity prices dictated in London and Amsterdam. The sovereignty of the gate had been broken, and the wealth of the highlands was being used to fuel the industrialization of the very empires that had stolen the crop in the first place. Today, the port of Mocha is a ghost of its former self. The once grand stone warehouses and administrative buildings are derelict, their foundations eroded by the salt of the Red Sea. The people who live in the shadow of these ruins are survivors of a stolen industry, inhabiting a coastline that has been stripped of its economic heart. The investigation concludes that the modern poverty of the Tihama coast is not a natural state, it is the direct result of a global economic crime that was never prosecuted. The name mocha has been co-opted by global coffee chains to sell a flavor, while the actual place that gave its name to the drink is allowed to rot in isolation. This is the unseen Yemen, a place where the physical reality of the landscape is a constant reminder of a stolen future. The injustice of the 15th century monopoly's collapse is still visible in the hungry eyes of the coastal fishing communities who have no other way to survive. The land is still there, and the coffee trees still grow in the mountains, but the global financial architecture has been designed to ensure that the wealth never returns to its origin. As we move to investigate the annexed islands and the weaponized water of the highlands, we must remember that the decline of Yemen began with the theft of a bean. The gate of grief was widened by the greed of empires that realized the only way to control the world was to ensure Yemen remained too broken to claim its own success. The global obsession with the alien landscape of Socotra is the perfect tactical screen for an unfolding geopolitical crime. While the world's media focuses on the ethereal canopy of the dragon's blood tree and the island's reputation as a biological anomaly, a much more terrestrial transformation is taking place. This is not a travel destination, it is a biological fortress that has been effectively severed from the Yemeni mainland. The investigation reveals that the very features that make Socotra unique, its extreme isolation and its position 240 miles off the coast, are now being weaponized to facilitate a silent annexation. By framing the island as a prehistoric relic, external powers have created a narrative where the land is more important than the sovereignty of the people who inhabit it. The mystery of the trees is a distraction from the rapid installation of high-altitude surveillance arrays that now overlook the most critical maritime corridors in the Indian Ocean. The archipelago of Socotra is not a separate entity, it is an inextricable part of the Yemeni state, a fact supported by centuries of historical and legal records. For generations, the Mara Sultanate and later the modern Yemeni Republic maintained a sophisticated indigenous code of governance that balanced the island's unique ecology with the needs of its people. This was a sovereignty built on the preservation of a pre-Islamic, Semitic culture that lacks a written language but possesses a deep, oral history of environmental management. However, the investigation into the current administrative status of the island shows a deliberate blurring of these lines. Since 2018, the official Yemeni presence has been systematically eroded, replaced by a foreign humanitarian facade that masks a permanent military intent. The theft of Socotra is not occurring through a formal declaration of war, but through the slow, institutionalized displacement of the Yemeni flag from the island's high plateaus. Moving past the canopy of the ancient forests, the investigation reveals a pivot toward high-tech intelligence gathering. On the high limestone plateaus of Momi and Dixam, the traditional grazing lands of the Socotri people are being occupied by non-Yemeni telecommunication towers and maritime surveillance arrays. These are not tools for local development, they are part of a suprastrategy designed to monitor the Gardafui Channel and the Somali Sea. The forensic analysis of the equipment shows that these facilities bypass the Yemeni national network entirely, sending data directly to foreign intelligence hubs. This is the militarization of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, conducted under the guise of securing the region from the chaos of the mainland. While the international community remains silent, the island is being turned into a permanent, unsinkable aircraft carrier that grants its occupiers total maritime domain awareness over the intersection of 3 continents. The human consequence of this occupation is the systematic displacement of the Socotri indigenous code. For centuries, the islanders lived by a complex set of laws that prohibited the cutting of live trees and regulated the use of water and grazing land. This ecological stewardship is what allowed the island's unique flora to survive into the 21st century. Today, these ancient laws are being overridden by foreign contractors and military engineers who prioritize strategic infrastructure over environmental preservation. The Socotri people watch as their ancestral lands are surveyed for luxury resorts and foreign military outposts, projects that offer them no benefit and threaten the very survival of their culture. The pressure on the youth to adopt a new economic reality, dictated by occupiers rather than their own heritage, is silencing the Socotri language and erasing the human connection to the land that made the Galapagos of the Indian Ocean possible in the first place. The logistics of this silent annexation are visible in the arrival of unauthorized flights and the construction of infrastructure that serves no Yemeni purpose. Investigative monitors have documented the landing of transport aircraft and tourist flights at Socotra's airport that have not been cleared by the civil aviation authorities in Aden or Sana'a. These flights bring in more than just visitors, they bring the material for a new state within a state. Construction is currently underway on high-speed internet cables and electrical grids that operate independently of the mainland's crumbling systems. This is the creation of a forced dependency. By providing state-of-the-art infrastructure for their own strategic needs while the local hospitals remain empty of basic medical supplies, foreign powers are ensuring that the Socotri people have no choice but to accept the occupation. The island is being rebuilt not as a part of Yemen, but as a strategic asset for those who have the capital to seize it. The strategic geometry of Socotra's position makes it the most valuable piece of real estate in the Indian Ocean. It sits at the exact point where the Gulf of Aden meets the Arabian Sea, a location that allows for the total surveillance of global maritime trade passing toward the Suez Canal. To control Socotra is to hold a permanent grip on the jugular vein of the world's energy supplies. The investigation reveals that the stability foreign powers claim to provide is actually a mechanism for exclusive access. By isolating the island from the conflict on the mainland, they have created a vacuum where they can operate without oversight or accountability. This is the ultimate investigative gap. While the world is told that Yemen is too dangerous to visit, Socotra is being quietly integrated into a foreign military-industrial complex, ensuring that even if the mainland eventually finds peace, it will have lost its most strategic maritime outpost forever. The price of this strategic isolation is paid by the inhabitants of Socotra, who live in a state of forced disconnection from their own nation. While foreign intelligence facilities enjoy uninterrupted power and satellite communications, the local population often lacks access to basic fuel, food, and medicine. This is the paradox of the unseen. The world remains obsessed with the island's alien beauty but remains deaf to the cries of a people who are being occupied in slow motion. The mystery of Socotra is not why its trees look the way they do, but how a foreign power can successfully steal a sovereign territory while the international community looks the other way. The investigation concludes that the theft of the islands is the final stage of Yemen's managed decline. By breaking the mainland and stealing the outposts, the world ensures that the gate of grief remains under foreign management, and the Yemeni people remain a people without a horizon. The use of charitable foundations and non-governmental aid as a cover for geopolitical positioning is one of the most effective strategies of modern annexation. In Socotra, the investigation reveals a pattern where humanitarian missions serve as a primary legal front for the arrival of foreign military and intelligence personnel. These organizations often arrive with high-value medical equipment or construction materials, yet the personnel manning these facilities are frequently identified as former security contractors or technical specialists with no background in public health. By providing basic services that the fractured Yemeni state can no longer afford, these entities create a psychological dependency among the local population. They are not merely building clinics, they are establishing a permanent presence in strategic zones that would otherwise be restricted under Yemeni law. This is humanitarian camouflage at its most calculated. The aid becomes the justification for the occupation, and the suffering of the mainland provides the moral fog needed to shield these operations from international scrutiny. The most direct assault on Yemeni sovereignty is the ongoing bypass of the national visa and immigration system. Since early 2024, investigative monitors have documented hundreds of foreign citizens entering the Socotra archipelago on flights that originate in foreign capitals, carrying travel documents that have never been processed by the Yemeni Ministry of Interior in Aden or Sana'a. This is a legal breach of catastrophic proportions. By allowing individuals to enter, reside, and work on the island without a Yemeni visa, external powers are effectively treating Socotra as a separate, non-Yemeni territory. This is not a clerical error, it is a deliberate policy of administrative erasure. When a foreign national can land on a sovereign island and bypass the host nation's border controls, the host nation no longer exists in that space. This creates a dangerous precedent where the island is being slowly integrated into a foreign administrative orbit, making its eventual return to Yemeni control a logistical and legal impossibility. Control over the flow of information is the modern equivalent of a physical border. In Socotra, the installation of telecommunication towers and fiber optic networks that bypass the Yemeni national grid is a clear indicator of a long-term annexation strategy. In 2024 and 2025, several high-capacity cellular towers were erected on the island's central plateaus, operating on non-Yemeni frequencies and connecting directly to foreign satellite hubs. This ensures that every phone call, every data packet, and every digital transaction on the island is monitored and controlled by an external power, completely bypassing the Yemeni Ministry of Communications. This is the creation of a digital border that is invisible but absolute. By severing the island's digital link to the mainland, the occupiers are ensuring that the Socotri people are integrated into a foreign information ecosystem. This is not about providing internet access, it is about ensuring that the digital identity of the island is no longer Yemeni, but a subsector of a foreign intelligence network. The high-altitude Momi Plateau has become the most sensitive site of the silent annexation. This limestone ridge offers an unobstructed view of the maritime entrance to the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, making it a supreme location for signals intelligence. The investigation has identified several radar arrays and maritime sensors placed in these restricted zones, equipment that is designed to monitor the movement of every vessel within a 500-mile radius. These are not defensive tools for the protection of the island, they are offensive assets used to secure the Gate of Grief for the benefit of a specific global alliance. The placement of these sensors on the Momi Plateau allows for total maritime domain awareness, granting the occupiers the ability to track, identify, and potentially target any ship passing through the world's most critical trade corridor. This is the militarization of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, carried out in total silence while the world remains distracted by the conflict on the mainland. Under the cover of the ongoing war, a systematic land grab is being executed through a network of foreign shell companies. These entities are purchasing vast tracts of protected coastal land and interior grazing territories, a direct violation of the Yemeni constitution which strictly prohibits the sale of protected heritage sites to non-citizens. The forensic analysis of these transactions reveals that the ultimate owners of these companies are often high-ranking officials and investors linked to foreign governments. This is the commercial front of the annexation. By acquiring the physical land, they are creating a permanent legal claim that will be used to justify the presence of foreign security forces to protect their investments. The Socotri people are being priced out of their own island, watching as their ancestral lands are surveyed for luxury resorts and private military compounds that offer no benefit to the local economy and further erode the sovereign map of Yemen. The systematic marginalization of the Yemeni-appointed governor of Socotra is the final stage of the administrative takeover. The investigation reveals that while a local governor technically exists, his authority is entirely symbolic. All major decisions regarding infrastructure, security, and trade are made by a parallel administrative structure that answers only to foreign military commanders stationed on the island. This shadow governorate controls the flow of resources, the distribution of aid, and the movement of people, effectively rendering the official Yemeni government irrelevant. This is a policy of deliberate displacement. By ensuring that the local officials have no power and no budget, the occupiers are training the population to look to a foreign master for their survival. This is not a temporary measure of stability, it is the permanent replacement of a sovereign state with a managed dependency that ensures the island remains a strategic asset for those who have the power to occupy it. This is the ultimate expression of Pillar 3, deliberate erasure. You do not need to drop bombs to remove a place from a nation's map, you only need to bypass its laws, replace its infrastructure, and silence its officials. By 2026, the Socotra archipelago has been effectively deleted from the sovereign reality of the Yemeni people. It exists as a biological and strategic fortress that is managed, monitored, and owned by entities that have no legal right to be there. The sovereignty in the fog is the mechanism that allows this theft to occur without a single shot being fired. The mystery is not what is happening, the evidence is visible in every unauthorized flight and every foreign tower. The mystery is how the international community can witness the slow-motion theft of a sovereign nation's territory and remain silent. The Gate of Grief is being reshaped, and Socotra is the first piece of the puzzle to be permanently removed from the Yemeni board. The strategic geometry of Socotra's position at the exact midpoint of the Indian Ocean's primary transit lanes provides a mathematical advantage that no other piece of land on Earth can replicate. It is the center of a circle that encompasses the most vital maritime arteries of the modern world. From this single limestone rock, an occupant can project power north toward the Persian Gulf, west toward the Suez Canal, and south toward the Cape of Good Hope. This is the suprastrategy of Socotra. It is not just an island, it is the pivot point of the global energy and data trade. Every tanker carrying oil to Europe and every container ship bringing goods to Asia must pass within striking distance of its shores. The investigation reveals that the geographical isolation of the archipelago is actually its greatest military asset, providing a protected, offshore platform that is far enough from the mainland conflict to remain stable, yet close enough to the trade lanes to exert total control over the global economy's jugular vein. The northern cliffs of Socotra function as a natural watchtower overlooking the Guardafui Channel. From these high-altitude vantage points, foreign intelligence arrays maintain an unobstructed line of sight, monitoring every vessel that exits the Red Sea. This is the forensic reality of maritime domain awareness. By utilizing the island's elevation, occupiers can track the electronic signatures and physical movements of global shipping with a precision that satellite surveillance cannot match. This is why the plateaus are being restricted. They provide the ultimate high ground in a new kind of electronic warfare. The mystery of why such a remote place has become a site of intense interest for global powers is solved by looking at the radar horizons. To hold these cliffs is to have a permanent, unblinking eye on the most sensitive choke point in the world. It is the ability to decide who passes through the Gate of Grief and who is denied access to the world's most critical maritime corridor. The investigation into the southern coastline reveals a deep-water ambition that has nothing to do with local fishing or commerce. In the natural harbors of the archipelago, unauthorized maritime infrastructure is being installed to facilitate the docking of heavy naval vessels. This is the conversion of a UNESCO World Heritage Site into a functional naval platform. The forensic analysis of the construction shows the use of reinforced concrete and specialized dredging equipment that is only required for high-tonnage military ships. Why is a natural harbor being deepened in a zone with no industrial economy? The answer lies in the need for a permanent, offshore logistical hub that can resupply carrier groups and submarine fleets without relying on the volatile ports of the mainland. This is the creation of a sovereign, foreign base in the middle of the Indian Ocean, a facility that allows for the projection of naval power across 3 continents while bypassing the laws and oversight of the Yemeni state entirely. The logistics of the shadow base operating on Socotra are designed to ensure the foreign military presence is entirely independent of the Yemeni mainland. Supply chains for fuel, food, and technical equipment now originate from foreign ports, arriving on chartered vessels and military transport aircraft that bypass the national customs of Yemen. This is a 24/7 operational capability maintained in total isolation from the people of the island. The investigation shows that while the local Socotri villages suffer from a lack of basic electricity and clean water, the shadow base enjoys state-of-the-art desalination plants and satellite-linked power grids. This technical disparity is a tool of control. By maintaining a standard of living for the occupiers that is decades ahead of the local population, the foreign powers ensure that the island functions as a self-contained ecosystem, a piece of foreign territory grafted onto a Yemeni island. The base does not exist to serve Socotra. Socotra has been forced to exist as the foundation for the base. This specific rock is the key to the suprastrategy of 3 continents. By controlling Socotra, a global power can simultaneously influence the security of Africa, Asia, and the maritime approaches to Europe. It is the ultimate, forward operating base, in a century defined by the competition for maritime dominance. The investigation into the regional military maneuvers shows that the island is being integrated into a broader geopolitical chess move, a permanent unsinkable aircraft carrier that anchors the influence of foreign alliances in the southern hemisphere. This is the reason that chaos on the mainland is allowed to persist. As long as Yemen is too broken to claim its islands, the occupiers have a free hand to fortify this strategic prize. The theft of Socotra is not a localized incident, it is a global realignment of power where the sovereignty of a nation is traded for the tactical convenience of a few superpowers who need a permanent platform at the crossroads of the world. The human consequence of transforming a home into a military platform is the permanent displacement of the Socotri identity. When a landscape is redefined as a platform, the people who have lived there for millennia are reduced to logistical obstacles or security risks. The identity of the Socotri people, built on a unique language and a code of environmental stewardship, is being overridden by a military-industrial logic that sees only coordinates and radar ranges. This is the price of the permanent platform. The islanders are being pushed into the margins of their own land, watching as their ancestral grazing plateaus are turned into restricted zones for foreign censors. The theft is not just of the soil, but of the future. A generation is growing up in the shadow of an occupation that treats their home as a strategic asset to be managed rather than a culture to be respected. The investigation concludes that once an island is turned into an aircraft carrier, the people who live there are effectively erased from the map, replaced by a silent, permanent garrison of foreign intent. The statistical reality of the hydraulic trap reveals a chilling precision in the dismantling of the Yemeni state. Nearly 45% of the country's water-related infrastructure has been rendered inoperable, a figure that is too high to be dismissed as collateral damage. The investigation into the geography of this destruction shows a pattern that targets the very lifeblood of the highlands. We are looking at a calculated engineering of deprivation. In a landscape where survival is a vertical struggle against the desert, the removal of a single pumping station or the fracturing of a main conduit can dehydrate an entire mountain district in a matter of days. This is not just the destruction of property, it is the strategic removal of the biological basis for human life. By targeting the water, the architects of this crisis have created a state of managed desperation that forces the population to prioritize the next gallon of liquid over any form of political or social agency. A forensic look at the damaged pumping stations and desalination plants reveals that these sites were not hit by accident. They were specific points of tactical removal, often located miles away from any active front line. In the coastal Tihama and the central highlands, the machinery required to lift water from the deep aquifers has been systematically targeted or denied the fuel needed to operate. This is the weaponization of physics. When the pumps stop, the cities of the desert begin to die from the inside out. The investigation shows that by cutting the power to these facilities, external forces have effectively placed a siphon on the nation's future. The desalination plants, once symbols of modern progress, are now rusted monuments to a sovereignty that was traded for dependency. This is a silent form of warfare that leaves no craters but creates a void where a functioning society used to be. The desiccation of the highlands represents the most profound cultural loss in the history of the peninsula. For thousands of years, the Yemeni people maintained an ancient system of mountain terraces and rain-harvesting basins that provided a local, decentralized autonomy. These were the stone-built lungs of the nation. The investigation into the recent destruction of these terraces reveals a deliberate effort to break this self-sufficiency. When the mountain basins are fractured by kinetic strikes or neglected due to the forced displacement of the farmers, the water is no longer captured, it becomes a destructive force of erosion that carries the soil into the sea. This is the dismantling of the Sabaean legacy. By destroying the small-scale infrastructure of the highlands, the hydraulic trap ensures that the people can no longer grow their own food or sustain their own villages, forcing them into the overcrowded, water-starved urban centers where they are easier to monitor and control. The transition from a kinetic war to a biological siege is the most terrifying evolution of the Yemeni crisis. There is a direct, forensic causal link between the lack of clean water and the introduction of preventable, waterborne outbreaks. This is not a natural disaster, it is a man-made viral landscape. When the sewage systems fail and the clean water pipes are dry, the human body becomes the new battlefield. The investigation reveals that the timing of these outbreaks often coincides with the most intense periods of infrastructure targeting. This is a form of silent warfare that bypasses traditional defenses. By ensuring that the population is chronically dehydrated and exposed to contaminated sources, the occupiers have created a managed biological pressure that saps the energy of the resistance. A father who is watching his children succumb to a preventable infection is a father who no longer has the capacity to demand the return of his nation's sovereignty. The scarcity of water has birthed a predatory shadow economy where the basic right to life is traded for astronomical prices. In the absence of a functioning public utility, a black market of private water tankers has emerged, controlled by the same entities that benefit from the state's fragmentation. This is the commercialization of survival. The investigation into these price spikes reveals that a single tank of water can now cost a significant portion of a family's monthly income. This creates a feedback loop of poverty. The money that should be spent on education, healthcare, or rebuilding the home is instead funneled into a network of privateers who profit from the desiccation of the land. This is the ultimate hydraulic trap, a system where the very liquid needed to survive is used to bankrupt the population and enrich the gatekeepers of the crisis. The final reservoir of the Yemeni nation is the resilience of its people. Despite the systematic weaponization of thirst, the investigation has documented countless examples of local communities innovating their own survival against the biological siege. In the remote villages of the Sarawat Mountains, people are reviving ancient, forgotten techniques of fog harvesting and stone-lining their wells to protect the last of the groundwater. This is the human response to a managed desiccation. They are refusing to let their identity be erased by the lack of a pipe or a pump. The weaponization of thirst is designed to break the spirit, yet it has instead forced a return to the indigenous mastery of the landscape. The moral weight of this section lies in the realization that the Yemeni people are fighting a war against the very elements themselves, holding on to their land with a tenacity that the architects of the trap never anticipated. The water may be scarce, but the will to remain is still a surging river. The statistical reality of the highland aquifers reveals a paradox that is central to the managed decline of the Yemeni state. Nearly 30% of the nation's most precious resource, its ancient, non-renewable groundwater, is diverted every day to the cultivation of a single, non-nutritional narcotic. This is the siphon of the high plateaus. In a region where the population faces a level of thirst that is globally unprecedented, the engineering of the landscape has been pivoted to support a crop that offers no caloric value. The investigation into this water diversion shows a chilling efficiency. While the public utility networks for human consumption are allowed to fracture and fail, the private irrigation systems for the cat fields remain meticulously maintained. This is a deliberate prioritization of a stimulant over survival. The deep fossil aquifers, which took millennia to fill, are being drained at a rate that far exceeds their natural recharge, all to sustain a harvest that will be consumed and discarded within 24 hours. This is the ultimate hydraulic trap, a system where the very liquid needed to rebuild the nation's health is instead used to fuel a state of localized, chemical distraction that prevents the population from ever addressing the root causes of their thirst. A forensic look at the mountain terraces reveals that the high-profit cat shrubs have physically displaced the ancient crops that once formed the backbone of Yemeni food security. For centuries, these stone-walled lungs of the nation produced world-class coffee and drought-resistant wheat, providing a level of self-sufficiency that allowed the highlands to remain sovereign. Today, those terraces are being stripped of their heritage to make room for a plant that yields a higher immediate cash return but destroys the long-term viability of the soil. This is the replacement of the terrace. The investigation reveals that the transition from coffee to cat was not merely a market shift, it was a calculated abandonment of the identity anchor. When a farmer chooses a narcotic over a grain, he is trading his role as a provider for a role as a participant in a shadow economy. This shift has broken the nation's internal supply chain, making the population entirely dependent on imported food that is easily intercepted or taxed by external powers. The crumbling of the ancient terrace walls is a physical manifestation of this broken contract, where the ancestral knowledge of sustainable agriculture is being buried under a mountain of green leaves that offer no future. The chemistry of the afternoon, chewing hours, functions as a highly effective tool of managed compliance. Between the hours of 2 and 6 every day, a significant portion of the adult male population enters a state of localized, passive distraction. The investigation into the psychosocial impact of this ritual reveals that it is not a harmless cultural habit, but a political placation tool that siphons away the collective energy needed for social or political mobilization. During these hours, the problems of the nation, the lack of water, the crumbling infrastructure, and the loss of sovereignty, are discussed in a state of chemical euphoria that rarely translates into action. This is the harvest of distraction. By ensuring that the population remains in a rhythmic cycle of stimulation and subsequent depletion, the architects of the status quo have created a society that is too chemically preoccupied to demand a return to the rule of law. It is the perfect mechanism for maintaining a state of permanent stagnation. The green leaf provides the illusion of community while ensuring that the actual community remains fragmented and politically inert. The internal economy of the cat trade has created a closed-loop system that prevents capital from ever leaving the shadow market to rebuild the actual state. Unlike coffee or frankincense, cat cannot be exported, it must be consumed within 48 hours of being picked. This means that the billions of reals spent on the crop every year circulate exclusively within a predatory internal network, enriching a small class of landowners and transporters while draining the savings of the working poor. The investigation into these financial flows reveals that the cat trade acts as a massive internal tax on the population, a siphon that redirects the wealth of the highlands into a dead-end market. This capital is never invested in schools, hospitals, or the restoration of the Great Dam, it is spent on the next day's leaves. This economic trap ensures that the Yemeni people remain in a state of managed poverty, where their hard-earned currency is continuously recycled into a narcotic that offers no return on investment. The green leaf is the invisible siege of the highlands, ensuring that even without foreign bombs, the nation remains too broke and too distracted to ever claim its own greatness. The structural vulnerability of the vertical antiquity in the heart of Sana'a is a challenge to both architectural history and modern engineering. These towers, some rising 8 stories, are masterpieces of fired brick and rammed earth, held together by nothing more than gravity and the precision of their construction. For over a millennium, they have withstood the seismic shifts of the highlands, but they were never designed to survive the modern saturation of their foundations. The investigation into these gingerbread-colored skyscrapers reveals a forensic nightmare. The very density that made Sana'a a marvel is now its greatest weakness. When a single wall loses its integrity, the entire vertical stack is compromised. We are looking at a skeletal system made of organic materials that is being pushed far beyond its load-bearing limits. The city is a living artifact, a vertical record of human habitation that is currently being subjected to a level of environmental and structural stress that no ancient builder could have anticipated. The subterranean siege of the old city is a disaster occurring in total silence beneath the cobblestone streets. The failure of the 1980s-era water and sewage infrastructure has turned the ground into a liquefying hazard. For decades, leaking pipes have been saturating the porous soil, turning the firm earth into a soft, unstable slurry. This is groundwater rot. The investigation reveals that the foundations of these 500-year-old towers are literally dissolving as the water undermines the clay and stone bases. Unlike the kinetic damage of an explosion, this rot is invisible until the moment of catastrophic failure. When the ground loses its ability to support the weight of the fired brick walls, the towers begin to tilt, crack, and eventually fold in on themselves. This is the slow-motion drowning of a civilization, where the very liquid meant to sustain life is instead being used to erase the architectural memory of the nation. While direct strikes on the UNESCO-protected center are rare, the investigation shows that the city is suffering from a form of indirect seismic fatigue. Nearby strikes on the surrounding hills and administrative districts send powerful tremors through the saturated soil of the old city. These are not direct hits, but they are equally lethal to the ancient masonry. Each vibration acts as a hammer blow to a structure already weakened by groundwater rot. The forensic analysis of the resulting cracks shows a pattern of structural failure that radiates from the base to the highest terraces. The mortar, made of traditional gypsum and lime, is brittle. It can withstand 1,000 years of wind, but it cannot absorb the shockwaves of modern high-explosive ordnance. Every tremor shifts the delicate balance of the towers, widening the gaps between the bricks and ensuring that the next seasonal rain will penetrate deeper into the core of the building. The human consequence of this collapse is the permanent displacement of a 500-year-old family lineage. In Sana'a, a house is not just property, it is a vertical archive of a family's history, with each floor representing a different generation's contribution to the structure. The investigation into the abandoned towers reveals a profound sense of loss. When a tower falls, it is not just bricks that are lost, but the physical connection to half a millennium of ancestral residency. Families who have inhabited the same rooms since the era of the Ottoman expansion are now being forced to flee into the modern, concrete outskirts of the city. This is the erasure of the social fabric of the highlands. The loss of a single tower is the death of a family's identity, a permanent severance from the soil and the stone that defined their place in the world. The city is being emptied of its original inhabitants, replaced by a void of dust and debris. The collapse is being accelerated by a total maintenance vacuum. The USTA, the master masons who once possessed the secret knowledge of how to patch, lime wash, and reinforce these delicate structures, are vanishing. The investigation reveals that the economic strangulation of the city has made it impossible for families to afford the specialized labor required to save their homes. Without the rhythmic ritual of plastering and the precise replacement of failing bricks, the towers have no defense against the elements. This is the loss of a guild system that has existed for centuries. When the master masons are forced to abandon their trade for survival, the city loses its immune system. The knowledge of how to balance a 9-story tower of mud and brick is not found in books. It is held in the hands of the elderly craftsmen who are now passing away without a new generation to take their place. The city is being abandoned not just by its people, but by its own intellect. The forensic conclusion of the investigation into Sana'a is that we are witnessing a civilizational liquefaction. The old city is a symbol of the broader Yemeni state, a masterpiece of human ingenuity that is being allowed to return to the earth through a policy of managed neglect and subterranean decay. It is the physical manifestation of a nation that is being dissolved from within. The liquid rot beneath the streets and the seismic shockwaves from above have combined to create a scenario where the history of the world is being erased one brick at a time. This is the ultimate investigative gap. While the world documents the loss of artifacts in museums, it remains silent as an entire living city is allowed to melt into the desert. The liquefaction of Sana'a is the final evidence of a strategy designed to ensure that the Yemeni people have no physical past to return to, and no vertical future to build upon. The towers are falling, and with them, the last sovereign pillars of the highlands. The technical density of the Bab el-Mandeb represents the most concentrated digital choke point on the planet. Beneath the turbulent surface of these waters lies a silent, tangled web of fiber optic cables that carry nearly 20% of the world's internet traffic. This is the submarine anatomy of the global economy. Every financial transaction in London, every data packet in Mumbai, and every digital signal moving between Europe and Asia must navigate a narrow corridor of Yemeni seabed less than 20 miles wide. The investigation into this undersea geography reveals that the Gate of Grief is not just a maritime passage, it is the physical heart of the global network. To control these cables is to hold the power to slow, disrupt, or intercept the very lifeblood of modern civilization. For the Yemeni state, these cables were once a symbol of strategic leverage, a sovereign right to host the world's data. However, as the conflict above the water intensifies, the cables beneath the blood have become the target of a new kind of invisible siege, where the physical severance of a fiber is used to justify a permanent geopolitical realignment. A forensic look at recent maritime incidents reveals a pattern of distressed vessels that suggests a calculated tactical cover for infrastructure sabotage. In the shallow waters surrounding the Hanish Islands, multiple fiber optic arrays have been damaged by what are officially described as dragged anchors from merchant ships experiencing mechanical failure. Yet, the investigation into these specific coordinates shows that many of these vessels were drifting in zones where anchoring is strictly prohibited and technically unnecessary. This is the distressed vessel protocol, a method of plausible deniability that allows for the physical destruction of Yemeni-hosted data links without the need for a kinetic strike. By attributing the damage to accidental maritime negligence, external powers can justify the immediate and permanent rerouting of their data. Each severed cable serves as a diagnostic test for the global network's resilience. The goal is not just to break the connection, but to create a sustained environment of unreliability that forces the world to look for a way around the Yemeni seabed entirely, regardless of the cost or the legal implications. The rapid investment in terrestrial and subsea alternatives reveals the true intent behind the digital siege, the construction of a permanent data detour. While the Yemeni cables remain unrepaired due to security concerns, massive capital is being funneled into new projects that reroute global traffic through foreign-controlled hubs in the Mediterranean and across the Arabian Peninsula. This is the engineering of a digital bypass. The investigation reveals that these new routes are specifically designed to circumvent Yemeni territorial waters, effectively deleting the nation from the global information map. This is a long-term economic strike. By creating an alternative digital Silk Road that excludes the Gate of Grief, external powers are ensuring that Yemen remains a data vacuum. This detour is not a temporary fix, it is a permanent infrastructure shift that will prevent the Yemeni state from ever again claiming its rightful transit fees or its role as a regional telecommunications hub. The nation is being bypassed in real time, left with a legacy of severed wires while the rest of the world builds a faster, more secure future that deliberately leaves them behind. The loss of the sovereignty of the signal represents a catastrophic economic and legal blow to the future of the Yemeni state. Historically, a nation's control over the cables passing through its territorial waters was a recognized form of maritime sovereignty, granting it the right to tax transit and ensure the security of the infrastructure. The investigation into the current status of these agreements reveals a systematic erosion of these rights. As the digital bypass is completed, the Yemeni Ministry of Communications is being stripped of its leverage. The world is moving toward a model where data sovereignty is dictated by the owners of the detour rather than the inhabitants of the land. This is the commercialization of an international commons. By delegitimizing the Yemeni state's ability to protect its own seabed, foreign corporations and military alliances are seizing control of the signal. The result is a nation that is physically present at the choke point but legally invisible to the network. Yemen is losing its right to be a gatekeeper, becoming instead a silent witness to a wealth that flows right beneath its shores but never touches its people. The human consequence of the digital siege is the deliberate and total isolation of the Yemeni population from the global digital economy. When the undersea cables are severed or bypassed, it is not just the international banks that suffer, it is the Yemeni student trying to access an online library, the doctor attempting to consult with a specialist abroad, and the family trying to receive a life-saving remittance. This is the human silence. By disconnecting a nation from the network, the architects of the siege have created a digital wall that is as effective as any physical blockade. The investigation shows that this isolation is not an accidental byproduct of the war, but a central pillar of the managed decline. A population that cannot communicate with the outside world is a population that can be oppressed in silence. Without a stable internet connection, the Yemeni people are denied the tools for innovation, education, and economic recovery. They are being relegated to a pre-digital existence, forced to watch from the sidelines as the world's data-driven progress accelerates. The disconnection is the ultimate erasure, a way to ensure that the Gate of Grief remains a place of local suffering rather than a hub of global significance. The statistical reality of 17 million food-insecure people in the heart of the Arabian Peninsula is not a disaster of nature, but a deliberate breakdown of the global supply chain. This is the logistics of caloric scarcity. In a nation that imports 90% of its basic grain, the control of the sea is the control of the stomach. The investigation into the flow of wheat and rice reveals that the Gate of Grief has been turned into a mechanical valve, opened and closed not by the weather, but by the strategic requirements of a managed siege. This is a hunger that has been engineered in the boardrooms of global shipping firms and the naval command centers of the Red Sea. By ensuring that the caloric intake of a population remains just above the level of mass expiration, external powers have created a state of perpetual weakness. A person whose every waking moment is consumed by the search for bread is a person who has no capacity to demand the return of their sovereign rights. Hunger is the ultimate tool of pacification. It is the silent, invisible infantry that occupies every home in the highlands without firing a single shot. A forensic look at the maritime industry reveals that the most effective weapon of this war is not the missile, but the insurance premium. This is paper warfare. By designating the waters of the Red Sea as a high-risk zone, global insurance cartels have imposed astronomical war risk premiums on any vessel attempting to dock at a Yemeni port. These costs are not absorbed by the shipping companies, they are passed directly to the Yemeni worker. The investigation shows that these premiums function as an invisible wall, driving the price of a single bag of flour beyond the reach of the average family. This is the financial architecture of the siege. By manipulating the perceived risk of the maritime corridor, the international community has effectively imposed a massive, private tax on the act of eating. It is a brilliant, bloodless mechanism that allows for the economic strangulation of a nation while maintaining the facade of a functioning market. The premium is the toll booth of blood, where the wealth of the poor is siphoned away to pay for the security of the very powers who are blockading them. The investigation into the movement of cargo reveals a systematic forced redirection of essential goods from the natural deep-water ports of the Red Sea to distant, foreign-controlled hubs. This is taxation by distance. By preventing large container ships from docking at the historic gateways of Hodeidah or Salif, the architects of the siege forced the rerouting of food through ports hundreds of miles away in the south or east. This adds a lethal layer of complexity and cost to the supply chain. Every extra mile of road transport represents another opportunity for delay, spoilage, and the accumulation of unauthorized fees. This is the engineering of a logistics vacuum. The natural geography of the Yemeni coast is being bypassed, replaced by a convoluted, inefficient network that ensures the food arrives late, expensive, and in diminished quantities. This redirection is a calculated strike against the urban centers of the north, forcing the population to look to the occupiers for their basic survival and ensuring that the historic ports of the Red Sea remain rusted, empty, and economically dead. Beyond the maritime blockade lies a network of internal checkpoints and shadow taxes that turn a basic bag of flour into a luxury item by the time it reaches the highlands. This is the internal siphoning of the nation's lifeblood. The investigation has documented a toll booth of blood at every major mountain pass, where local commanders and privateers extract a percentage of the cargo's value in exchange for passage. This is the fragmentation of the state made visible. By the time a shipment of grain travels from the coast to the kitchens of Sana'a, its price has been inflated by a series of predatory layers that benefit only the gatekeepers of the crisis. This internal siege is a parasite that feeds on the hunger of the people, ensuring that even if the external blockade were lifted, the cost of survival would remain prohibitive. It is a system designed to bankrupt the household, forcing the Yemeni family to trade their dignity and their ancestral property for a single week of nutrition. The toll is paid in the health of the children and the desperation of the parents. The human anatomy of this siege is visible in the kitchens of Hodeidah and the mountain villages of the Sarawat. Here, the macroeconomic premium and the toll booth of blood translate into a micro-reality of calculated deprivation. This is the moral weight of a weaponized appetite. The investigation has followed the path of a single grain of wheat from a foreign silo to a Yemeni plate, documenting a journey defined by greed and geopolitical maneuvering. To see a mother forced to choose which of her children will eat today is to see the ultimate failure of the international order. This is the affection of the investigator, the realization that these are not just statistics, but a systematic assault on the most basic human bond. The food weapon is designed to break the spirit of the nation by attacking the body of the family. Yet, even in the face of this managed siege, the people of the highlands continue to share what little they have, maintaining a code of hospitality that the architects of the hunger can never understand. The gate of grief is a place of profound suffering, but it is also a place where the human will to survive is proven every single day. The investigation into the seabed reveals a chemical nightmare that is currently rewriting the biology of the Red Sea. Thousands of tons of fertilizer and hazardous industrial materials now sit in the shallow coastal waters, the result of unauthorized maritime incidents and the wreckage of transport vessels. This is the chemistry of the sunken cargo. When these nitrogen-rich compounds dissolve into the brine, they trigger massive, toxic blooms that strip the oxygen from the water, creating vast, dead zones, where no life can persist. This is a deliberate, slow-motion poisoning of the commons. These materials were never meant to be deposited on the reef, yet their presence serves as a permanent deterrent to any local maritime activity. The forensic reality is that the seabed has been turned into a toxic graveyard, a repository of pollutants that will continue to leak for decades. This is not a series of accidents, it is the creation of a chemical barrier that ensures the Yemeni coast is no longer a source of nutrition, but a hazard to be avoided by the very people who have relied on its tides for 1,000 years. The deteriorating tanker infrastructure and localized oil leaks are being utilized as an ecological border, no-go zone, that prevents local movement. This is the slick siege. In the waters off the Tehama coast, the threat of a catastrophic spill from neglected vessels is used as a constant psychological and physical pressure. The investigation shows that while the international community expresses concern for the environment, the actual containment efforts are secondary to the strategic benefit of the blockade. These leaks create a persistent, oily film that destroys the mangroves and the spawning grounds of the local fish populations. This is the weaponization of neglect. By allowing the maritime infrastructure to rot, external powers have created a biological fence. A fishing boat cannot cross a sea of oil, and a village cannot survive on a coast where the water itself is a fire hazard. The slick is an invisible wall, a floating perimeter that keeps the Yemeni people trapped on the shore while the wealth of their waters is poisoned beneath the waves. The displacement of the traditional fishing communities represents the systematic erasure of the Tehama lineage. For centuries, these coastal families practiced an ancient method of artisanal survival, using the seasonal rhythms of the Red Sea to sustain the highlands. Today, those methods are being rendered impossible by the toxicity of the water and the restrictive security protocols that treat every dhow as a potential threat. The investigation reveals a culture in terminal decline. When the nets come up empty or filled with chemically stunted catch, the social fabric of the coast begins to unravel. This is the death of a maritime heritage. The knowledge of the reefs, passed down through generations of oral history, is being lost as the youth are forced to abandon the sea for the crowded, hungry interior. The Tehama people are being severed from their primary identity, turned from masters of the tide into landlocked refugees. The sea, which was once their greatest provider, has become a source of grief and a reminder of their powerlessness. While local artisanal fishers are restricted by security protocols, foreign commercial vessels are using the lack of Yemeni naval oversight to strip the reefs in the fog of war. This is the predator of the reef. The investigation into satellite tracking data reveals massive industrial trawlers operating deep within Yemeni territorial waters, using destructive methods that pulverize the coral and vacuum the seafloor of its remaining life. These vessels operate with total impunity, knowing that the Yemeni Coast Guard has been dismantled or co-opted. This is a double theft, first of the fish, and then of the future. While the world is told that the Red Sea is too dangerous for local commerce, it is apparently a safe harbor for foreign corporations to extract the nation's natural wealth. This industrial pillaging ensures that even if the conflict ends tomorrow, the biological capacity of the sea to recover will have been compromised. The reefs are being hollowed out, leaving behind a barren, skeletal landscape that can no longer support a sovereign Yemeni economy. The ecological collapse of the Red Sea is the final investigative pillar in the transformation of a resource into a hostile barrier. A dying sea is no longer a bridge to the world, it is a toxic, impassable border that isolates the Yemeni people from their neighbors. The investigation concludes that the gate of grief has been closed by biological means. By poisoning the water, destroying the reefs, and displacing the fishers, the architects of this crisis have ensured that the coast is a zone of exclusion rather than a gateway of trade. This is the ultimate, investigative gap. We are witnessing the death of a sea as a functional entity. The pulse of the Red Sea is fading, and with it, the last hope for a maritime-based recovery for the nation. The sea has become a graveyard not just for ships, but for the very possibility of a self-sustaining Yemeni future. The water is now a wall, and the horizon is a limit rather than an invitation. The investigation reveals that the most permanent border is the one that is built into the environment itself. The investigation has reached its final, most disturbing conclusion. The term, failed state, is a linguistic trap designed to mask a highly organized, external management of the nation's territory. To call Yemen failed is to suggest that its current condition is a natural disaster or an internal collapse, rather than a deliberate, forensic dismantling of its sovereign functions. The evidence collected across the highlands, the islands, and the seabed shows that the chaos is not an accident, it is a tactical label used to justify the extraction of resources and the occupation of strategic choke points without international oversight. By framing the nation as a vacuum of authority, global powers have created a legal fog that allows them to bypass Yemeni law, install independent infrastructure, and control the flow of global data and energy while the world looks away. This is not a failure of a state, but the success of a suprastrategy that requires the host nation to remain permanently broken. The investigative gap is not a lack of information, but a refusal to see that the fragmentation of the map is a profitable, managed outcome for those who hold the gate. The synergy between the hydraulic trap, the digital siege, and the toll booths of blood reveals a unified architecture of managed exhaustion. This is the physiological weaponization of a population. By ensuring that every citizen is caught in a perpetual cycle of searching for water, paying for overpriced bread, and navigating a landscape of chemical distraction, the architects of this crisis have eliminated the possibility of a national recovery. A person who is chronically dehydrated and disconnected from the global network does not have the capacity to demand the return of their ancestral lands or the protection of their maritime rights. The investigation reveals that this exhaustion is a mechanical necessity for the occupation to persist. Every severed cable, every poisoned reef, and every crumbling terrace wall is a component in a system designed to keep the Yemeni people in a state of primitive survival while the high-tech infrastructure of the 21st century is built right beneath their feet. This is the ultimate, managed state, a nation where the only thing that is not allowed to function is the sovereignty of its own people. The final revelation of this investigation is the realization that the gate of grief is being closed to the Yemeni people so it can be opened exclusively for the benefit of a global elite. The paradigm shift is complete. We are not witnessing the death of a nation, but its transformation into a permanent, offshore asset for a world that requires its strategic location but has no use for its inhabitants. The people who built the skyscrapers of Sana'a and the terraces of the Sarawat are being erased from their own geography, replaced by a grid of sensors, tankers, and unauthorized flights. The mystery of the gate is solved not by looking at the conflict, but by looking at the silence that follows the theft of a sovereign identity. We have documented the slow-motion removal of a civilization from the physical and digital map of the world. The investigation concludes that while the stones of the old city may liquefy and the sea may turn to a graveyard, the intent of the occupiers remains as solid and cold as the plateaus they have seized. The most efficient way to steal a country is to ensure its people are too thirsty to remember they once owned the well.